We're going to explore some challenges about what happens when that goes wrong. We're going to talk about how to monitor it on your dairies. And then last, we'll spend just a little bit of time on the back end of the milk flow curve. So we have the milk flow curve here of an individual cow. On the bottom axis here, or the x-axis, we have time. On the y, we have flow in pounds per minute. So we attach this unit down here. Immediately you see on this cow, right, she goes to a high flow rate, okay, up here to a high flow rate. And this is what we call the front end of the curve, right, to about the first 2 minutes of time. Could be a little bit different depending on there. And then we have the back end of the curve, or what happens after peak flow rate. And we have the decline phase of the curve. And so we're going to talk about first the front end of the curve, and then second, the back end. So what do we want to see? This is what we want to see, right? This rapid, uninterrupted increase in milk flow to peak. So when we attach that unit to that cow, she's ready to milk. And when we put the unit on, her teats are full, and we immediately see that rise to peak flow. And we see no decline after that until she's finished milking, right? And then down. You can see this cow here. These graphs are from a unit called a lactocorder. This cow gave 31 pounds, and she did it in under 3 minutes. Rapid rise to peak, rapid full at the end. Okay, when we contrast that, this is what we call a bimodal flow curve, or a delayed milk ejection. It's kind of a newer term we're talking about with some of Ron Erskine's work and Roger Thompson's work out of Michigan. So what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is this flow curve. This is out of a herd we were at a couple weeks ago. They have 2 double 24 parlors. They milk about 3,500 cows. And too many of their cows, we see this flow curve. And what we see here, right, is we see milking start. It starts. We don't see that rise to peak that we want. And then it goes down. And then we see a second rise, or a second peak, right? So that's that bimodal. And so what happens during that time period is, if you look at the unit, this happens to be a picture. I don't have a picture from this dairy. It's a different dairy with a different claw. But you can see the illustration is that you actually see milk flow stop in the individual claw, right? Just as it shows here on the graph, it slows or stops, and then we see that second peak. Now, what happens to the cow during that period of time? If you watch the cow, a lot of those cows will start to step, or they'll start to kick at the unit because they start to become uncomfortable. And we'll show you some graphs about the vacuum and what's happening with that to help you understand why the cow is reacting like that during this time period. Okay? Just to give you an idea, right, that was an individual cow on that dairy, 3,500 cow dairy. Okay? This graph here is from a dairy that's 2,700 cows. They milk in a 72 stall rotary. And this is 6 months of data from that dairy. So each one of these days, right, represents all those 2,700 cows. They're milking 3 times a day. And what do we see here? If we look at this, we start to see the flow curves here. This dark blue line here is the first, This dark blue line is from 0 to 15 seconds. And we get about 1 pound per minute. Then we go up to this light pink line. That's the 15 to 30. Then notice what happens. We go down to this dark purple, or the 30 to 60 second flow. And then lastly, we go up to the peak flow, or the 60 to 120. So what does that mean? That means every day for 6 months on this herd, the average cow is bimodal out of these 2,700 cows. Day after day after day, right? So it's not just a problem on individual cows, right? We can see it at the herd level. In other words, at the herd level, we see this pattern, right, where we go up, and then at the 30 to 60 second interval, we come down, and then we go to peak. So we know on this dairy, right, we have a problem with letdown that's happening day after day. Okay? I'm going to step back for a second and just make sure we're all comfortable with a couple concepts about the physiology of milk letdown. So remember, the milk ejection is an inborn reflex that's not under the conscious control of the cow. You can think about a reflex. It's not quite like that, but you can think about it, right? When the doctor hits your knee and your knee jerks up, right? We don't want you to think about it quite like that because you need to stimulate the cow more than just an initial jerk, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute. But that's the way you can think about it, right? It's an inborn reflex. The second thing is to think about this in the bottom, right? If we go in there and stimulate that cow, if we do it 10 minutes after she left the parlor, we stimulate her, guess what's going to happen? She's going to let down milk again. It's just that reflex, right? And guess what? There's going to be milk in her still 10 minutes after she got milk. And we can harvest more milk again. We never completely milk cows out, and we don't want it because they're constantly producing milk, right? So that shouldn't be our goal, is to get every last drop of milk out of them, because when they leave the parlor, we could stimulate them again and bring them back around, and we could reharvest milk out of those cows. And that's what we want them to do, right? That's their job for us. Okay, if we think about this is just a graphic from Dr. Ron Erskine out of their group here, that Quality Milk Alliance. They've done a lot of good stuff. If you go on that website, there's quite a bit of good stuff they've done out of a grant. This is just a graphic to show you, right? When we stimulate this cow, okay, we stimulate her here on her teats. The nerve signal goes to the brain, okay, and that converts to a signal that says to the pituitary to release oxytocin into the bloodstream. Comes down to the heart, pumps through the aorta, right? Hits the udder. And when it hits the udder, right, that oxytocin then starts to act on those muscle cells, and it squeezes the milk, literally squeezes the milk. I'll show you a picture in a second. Squeezes the milk out of those alveoli. And then we need time from when it squeezes the milk until it hits the gland cistern. And that's why we need to wait after we stimulate a cow. We need to wait for this to happen. So the other background to make sure everybody understands is that milk is present in two different places in the cow's udder when she comes into the parlor, right? The first place is down here in that gland cistern and the teat cistern, right? So that milk is just sitting there. It's about 20% of the milk yield, depends. There's some variation, lactation and days in milk and that sort of thing. But that milk, all we have to do is we just open the teat canal. If we put a cannula in, it would just drain out. Passive, right? But that's only 20% of the milk. Remember, 80% of the milk is up in the alveoli, and that's where we need the oxytocin. It has to be squeezed out of there with oxytocin. It's under oxytocin control. And that's 80% of the milk. That's where we want, and that's why we need oxytocin and we need stimulation on these cows. So as we think about bimodal milk flow, right? First we harvest the cisternal, and then what do? We wait. And that's why we have that down, right? Because our alveolar milk is not there yet. Either we didn't stimulate her well, or we put the unit on too early. And therefore, we have to wait for that alveolar milk, which is the bulk of the milk. What we want, right, is we want the timing right and the stimulation right so that those two overlap. So we don't have to wait, and we don't have this period where we go down in milk flow. Everybody good with that? Okay? So as we think about the industry, right, one of the things, and one of the, the reasons that I'm happy to think through this talk is as we interact, and a lot of you in the room interact with a lot of dairymen, and probably a lot of dairymen in the room as well, right? But one of the things that we see a little bit from the industry is maybe that the pendulum has swung a little bit too far and thinking about milking speed and putting cows through the parlor too rapidly. And part of what I want you to think about today is Not necessarily going all the way over, right, but coming back toward the center a little bit that says, we want to think about the cow in the mix of this. And we want to make sure, right, that the things we know about the cow and how to stimulate her and how to get milk out of her well, that we're thinking about some of those and not just thinking about, totally about just pushing cows through a parlor and not concerned about how we're milking those cows. And what we'll talk about is what some of the effects are of the differences. So why do we care about bimodal, right? Remember, it has an influence on unit on time. Certainly in our work, some of Michigan's work, they didn't see as much. In our work, we certainly saw that when you have that decline, right, it stretches out the unit on time. Okay? Certainly has an influence on kickoffs and reattaches, cows reacting during that time when the milk flow goes down and the vacuum's up, more likely to kick off. That's when we see our liner slips at the start of milking in a lot of cases, right? Is during that bimodal period. We hear that squawk or that air admission, and we hear it during that time when the milk flow goes down and the cow starts to step. Okay? We send cows leaving the parlor not milked out because of bimodal milk. And the Michigan work, which we'll highlight in a second, right, now is putting on the table that's saying there's actually a loss of milk production here. We're leaving milk on the table by not doing a good job of prepping these cows. So all of these, right, we can think about it, parlor efficiency, mastitis, and certainly the bottom line due to the milk production are on the table. So what causes an actual failure of milk letdown, right? And the first and foremost on the list, right, is that we don't get adequate levels of oxytocin. And this is secondary to stimulation. Okay? As well, we're not going to talk about that at all today, but it's a big deal on some dairies, right? We can have this release of epinephrine or adrenaline, a blockage. For instance, right, if we get cows up out of the freestall, we run them into the parlor, we have loud noises, we have, places where the cows don't want to go, it's scary or stuff like that, right? We can have a blockage of this. We're not going to touch on that today, but it can happen. And then milking in unfamiliar surroundings, right, would probably be the fresh heifer discussion. First time she's in this parlor, and we actually get a release, the oxytocin release is blocked. So in that case, supplementing with oxytocin, right, does have an effect. In this case, notice when we release the epinephrine, right, what happens? It actually blocks the oxytocin receptors. So we can pour the whole bottle of oxytocin in her. It doesn't do any good because they're blocked. So we got to prevent that, right? So how does it look when we think about a milking routine, right? And remember what I said before, each farm's different. This is just one example. There's a lot of other good routines that don't look like this, so this doesn't have to be the one that you totally copy, right? But as a good example, right, would be we start with forestripping. We start the clock running. We stimulate her well. We're putting on there 5 to 10 seconds of time from forestripping. Then we're going to pre-dip her with a, an approved pre-dip. We're going to wait 30 seconds at least till we wipe that off. And the total time from the start of forestripping, when we started to forestrip her until we attach the unit for a 3X milk dairy, the goal would be 90 to 180 seconds. Making sure that we're trying to hit that window, right? We give them enough time to let down. That's why we start the clock early, forestrip them first, so that we don't have to wait. So what do we think? And in our herd surveys that we go out and do, so about 3 or 4 days a week we're out on a farm, and I spend a lot of time standing in parlors watching cows, teat scoring, and doing other stuff. And so for our surveys, the most important timing stuff that we're timing are these 3 things. What's the pre-dip contact time? Is it greater than 30 seconds? What's the initial stimulation time? How much time are the cows being stimulated? Is it 5 to 10 seconds or more? And lastly, what's the lag time? So that time from the start of stimulation until we attach the unit. And that's our 90 to 180 seconds, right? If you're on a 2X milk dairy, you might be able to sneak a little bit lower. If you're on a 4X dairy, we got some good data from when we had a wave of 4X go through the Northeast that we probably actually want to be a little bit longer in that lag time. So then the question we're really asking, right, is are there issues with the timing if it's being performed correctly? In other words, does the routine, on average, get us these timings in this correct way? Now, obviously, we can have individual milkers not doing their job, and that's a problem, right? It's a problem on dairies. But we also want to know, is the overall routine timed correctly, if everybody's doing the right job, right? Okay, I'm going to show you 3 different videos, right? And I want you to think about this from the standpoint of the cow and stimulation. So think about whether this cow is really being stimulated or not, right? So the first one, this is a double 23 parlor. It happens to be a Bimodal parlor, and they're milking about 1,800 cows through that. You didn't probably time it because it was so quick. It's about 3 seconds. 3 seconds of stimulation on that dairy. Okay? This dairy, the next dairy I'm going to show you, this is a 72 bale rotary. They're milking about 2,400 cows. There's 2 robots and 2 guys on this. You didn't time that? 2.8 seconds. That's the stimulation those cows get on that rotary. Okay? This is a double 30. They milk about 2,400 cows through this. And there's 3 guys in here, sets of 10. And by the time he's done, that's 15 seconds. About 7 seconds of strip, 8 seconds of white. The owner of this dairy has it, the GIA system. The middle was a deal valve rotary, that's the GIA. He has it from the GIA software. Every shift, at the end of the shift, those milkers can walk in there, separated by those 10 stalls, by their 10 stalls, and they can see their flow rates. And guess what? They go in there and do that. And they compete with each other for their flow rates. And they know how to get them right because they stimulate these cows. Okay, so what if we get it wrong? What happens? So we think about the cow, right? For the cow, we know she's uncomfortable because she starts to step and kick. More mastitis. Bad for cows, right? Bad for people, bad for the money, right? Certainly the teat, we talk about increased risk of damage. The parlor, why is it bad for the parlor? Increase in unit on time, right? Less efficient, the kickoffs, the reattaches, all of that. Milkers. You get in some of these dairies where they got a poor routine, and what you see is you see milkers just chasing themselves, right? They're reattaching unit. The cows are kicking them off. Cows are getting them dirty. They got to spray them off. We got a lot of hose use. We got manure flying all over the place. It's just bad for milking cows. And it starts with a good routine, right? If we do there. Why does the herd manager care, right? More mastitis than the owner. Okay, so less milk, more mastitis. And there's probably other reasons, right? This is just a quick list for you to think through that says it's bad for everybody when we don't do it right. Okay? Just for a second, I wanted to give you just a quick look at teat anatomy, right? And the major thing is, right, this is where the teat attacks to the udder, of course. The major thing I want you to look at is right here. It's called the annular fold, right? We want that liner placed down here. But we know during milking, right, as we milk this cow, what happens is the liner naturally creeps up toward the udder. And when it does, and you can see what happens, when we put pressure on both sides of the annular fold, we shut off the ability of the teat to refill with milk. Not what we want to do right at the beginning of milking. But we want to harvest milk out of this cow. We don't want to shut off our ability to do it, right? Here's a schematic. I'm not going to go into the details on it, right? But what happens is the dark there is the liner. Excuse me. Yeah. The dark there is the liner. So let's see here if I can get this there. Okay, the dark here, the black is the liner. This is the liner lip up here. And then we have this little area here that we call the mouthpiece chamber of the liner. And I'm going to show you in a minute when we have a vacuum recorder in that, and we have one at the teat end, why we care about this. You see on this, the teat is nice and filled. It fills that liner, so we don't have much vacuum going to the mouthpiece chamber. Mouthpiece chamber vacuum stays low. That's what we want. You can think about, though, if that teat pulls away from the liner, it allows vacuum to go toward the mouthpiece, and we see a higher mouthpiece chamber vacuum. Remember that the natural, as we go from the start of milking to the end of milking, we see that liner go up toward the teat base. It naturally does that. It pulls more teat in, and it moves the liner up. That's the force of vacuum on it. Obviously, that's influenced by weight on the claw and other things, right? That's why unit alignment, weight of claw, matching it to liner, all of those are super important because it influences this in terms of how the cow milks. Okay, a couple graphs here just to show you what we see when we think about milk flow. So this is a good letdown cow, right? That milk flow graph, we already talked about it, it's up on the top. She lets down very well, moves up to high peak flow. Now if we look at the vacuum down here in the bottom, the black line is the claw vacuum. Okay, so that's this black line right here. This is the claw vacuum. And then down here is the mouthpiece chamber vacuum. This is a well-milked cow, right? The mouthpiece chamber vacuum stays low throughout milking. She's happy. She doesn't like high mouthpiece chamber vacuum. Contrast that to this cow. This is a bimodal milk cow. See what happens? When that milk flow, okay, so we start here, the vacuum starts to go down, then the vacuum goes up when the milk flow goes down, this black line. And notice how the mouthpiece chamber vacuum goes high. This is when the cow starts to react. She doesn't like that. Okay, notice in this cow, that mouthpiece chamber vacuum never goes back down to where it should be. So she's milked under high vacuum her whole time in that teat, and she doesn't like that, and she'll let us know that sometimes by kicking the unit off, or certainly stepping or being uncomfortable, right? What do we see when we score teats? We see when that unit comes off, we see the teat in the left, right? Which is, you notice this line of demarcation, right, or this line right here where it's red down here. If you were to touch this teat, the cow would kick you, and you'd feel a firmness to it, right? Because we have not treated this teat well during milking. And so the extreme example is the one on the right where we see this was from a 3X dairy where we had the wrong, vacuum settings were wrong, right? And we see those little hemorrhage, that's broken, burst capillaries on the bottom. That's when we get it wrong and it matters to the cow, right? Too wrong. So she spends too much time in low flow at high vacuum. Okay, why else do they matter? So we know from some studies out of Europe and a study we did, Dr. Matthias Wieland, who's with our team here, he did a study, and we know that when we get it wrong in the parlor, and we see that edema at the teat end or hardness at the teat end, it influences how quickly their teat canals close when they leave the parlor. Our old thought was they leave the parlor right, we want to keep them standing for a half hour, and then the teat canals close and they can lay down. We now know, right, if we do it wrong in a parlor and they leave with that edema in the teat end, that it influences it. And on our study, it was a 3X milk dairy. We had it at the teaching dairy, right? Some of those cows, when they came back into milk 8 hours later, their teat canals still were not closed. Their canals are open. You know what that means when they lay in bedding that's not sterile. And very few bedding samples are sterile when you get them out of stall. So it's an open avenue, an open risk for mastitis in those cows. So what we do with the parlor influences a risk of environmental mastitis out in the stalls. Obviously, what we do with the stalls out there makes a deal too, right? It's not, I'm not discounting that at all, but the parlor there. Okay, this is a confusing slide. I apologize. I just put it all on here. This was our latest study that we did at the teaching dairy, and all I want you to look at is up top here. We randomized cows, and there was 2 treatments. The first treatment was forestrip and wipe those cows. The other half of the cows, we only wiped them. So the difference is, right, and we held the lag time constant. Every cow had 90 seconds of lag time. So the difference here, right, is in this. One group, we forestrip and wipe, we get 16 seconds of stimulation. One group, we only get 7 seconds because we only wipe them. Okay? And then we switched them. So 7 days on treatment, control group, we switch it. The other group goes on 7 days of treatment to make sure there was no cow effect. Right? Okay, what do we see? More bimodals when we didn't forestrip, longer unit on time, more risk of short-term teat damage. Now, this was at the teaching dairy, right? And we had a very good routine in there already, and we're getting 7 seconds of stimulation. So in this study, we actually did not see any difference in milk. But our interpretation of that was we already started with a very good routine. We already started with a 7 seconds of stimulation, right, versus some of our other studies where we might look at where we're getting 3, like I showed you on the real field data stuff. Right? So that was the difference. Okay. So Dr. Ron Erskine, Roger Thompson, the others at Michigan State, right? We presented at a short course with him at NMC in Michigan here during the summer, right? And their data shows 1 minute delay, 7 pounds of milk on that milking tossed away. That's their logo, that's their statement. Their research shows, right, that if we delay them by a minute for that delayed milk ejection, right, we don't get full milk ejection until a minute after we put it on, that we're losing 7 pounds of milk, probably on the mature cows, right? There's a difference between heifers and mature cows, right? That's true. There's a gradient there, right? But just as something easy to remember, Ron's got this slogan there is a minute delay, 7 pounds tossed away. So there's milk there from their studies that they did. And if you want those, I can give you, it's a Journal of Dairy Science article they published, peer-reviewed article. It's a good article if you want to read it. So what do I think for you guys? To me, your action item is go home and time your routine. Right? If you're out on dairies doing consultant, is time the routine. Make sure we're in those 3 critical areas that we outlined. If it's not correct, start thinking about how we can change it. And when you start putting the dollars on it, start putting the milk on it, right, it can be worth some major changes on your dairy to think about how we can do better for the cows. Okay? Without a good routine, right, it's going to be a big challenge to milk cows quickly, gently, and completely because we're going to have that bimodal flow. And when we have that, we don't milk cows out well, and we don't milk them necessarily as quick. Okay? So how do we monitor that, right? If we have parlor data, I'd encourage you to use 2-minute milk. In our hands, it's the easiest one to use. 2-minute milk. These numbers up here I gave you for 3 and 2x, definitely conservative. Dr. Reed in the room could probably give us examples where he's got way over that on dairies. And we got some too in New York, not maybe as many. But certainly dairies can do a lot better than this, but this is a good starting goal. Right? If we're not there above 15 for a 3x dairy, there's some issue with our routine that's not supporting good letdown. Right? If we don't have parlor data, then what you really got to do is you got to keep timing the routine, and you got to do it at unannounced times for your milkers. If you got videos, right, you can do it from the video, but time them and make sure they're doing it consistently. Because if they're not, it's the start of the problem. Okay, and what do we mean by 2-minute milk? Just so everybody's clear, right? So what we mean is the pounds of milk harvested in the first 2 minutes, and this is just an example here of 2 different cows, right? You can see the cow on the left here. I put that red line there. She gives 18 pounds in the first 2 minutes. Rapid rise to peak. Notice the cow on the right, we have that bimodal letdown, and so on her we get 7.3 pounds. And that's why we can use 2-minute milk as a measure of whether or not we're seeing bimodal letdown. We can use others, right? There's others we can use. We can use those flow intervals and that, but 2-minute milk seems to be easy for farms to use and remember and track. And that's why we tend to use it. Okay, so this is a double 12. I wrote the report yesterday, actually, for this dairy. We were just there. They hired a guy back in the early summer to actually start working with the milkers some. And so when I pulled this report up and wrote the report, right, what do I see? This is 2-minute milk. This is by the milkings. So milking 1 is red there. Milking 2 is blue, and milking 3 is pink. What do we see? This is from June until September. Every single day on this herd for 3 months of data. We see a nice rise, right? We see a pat in the back for this guy who's actually working with the milkers, starting to get a better routine in place, making sure that they're consistent. And we see that rise in 2-minute milk. Better routine, better harvested milk. Okay? So Just a couple other thoughts to make sure we haven't left them out, right? If we think about the front end of the curve, we also got to think about vacuum and pulsation, because they can be critical, especially if we don't have them set right. So the question for you, right, is for your dairy or the dairies you're on, right, have we measured the average claw vacuum at peak flow for that 5 to 30 second interval on at least 10 cows? If we don't know it, we're batting blind. We need to know it, because it's what we set, right? It's what we set your system based on what it is at the cow level, right? And what does that mean? It means the goals of your dairy have to be taken into account, the liner we're using, and the risk of over milking would be on the table in terms of where we set that vacuum level for your dairy. But if we don't know it, we can't set it. So we need to know it, right? This is just an example from about 6 months ago. We were on this dairy. Second time I'd been on the dairy. First time we've been, it was one of the best teat scored dairy that I've scored. And they happened to be on an IBA liner at that point, but they were a 1,000 cow dairy, double 20 parallel parlor, right? This is the second time we were there. They were complaining about an increase in clinical mastitis, and the cell count was going up. Immediately within the first half hour of scoring, I knew something was different, right? It's pretty obvious. The cows were telling us that. They're kicking. They're unhappy, right? This hardness at the teat end is what we call the short-term scores. So by scoring them, immediately we knew we were seeing edema at the teat end. We were measuring claw vacuum, right? The average claw vacuum was 13.3. I called up the dealer, and the dealer said, what do we want these liners set at, right? They wanted them at 11.5. Significantly out of line in terms of what the liner manufacturer, the range they want the liners, right? So we put in place a plan to lower the vacuum on this dairy, and it happened, and things got better. How about pulsation, right? Have we measured the pulsation adequately, right? And have we thought about if we change stuff, have we changed pulsation? This is a 700 cow dairy in a double 10, and they had changed liners. Unfortunately, when they did, the dealership didn't graph the pulsators. They changed from a 60-40 to a 65-35. And what we did was we took our D phase down below our general recommendation of 200 to 250. And the dairy was complaining to us. The reason we were there was because they were seeing an increase in mastitis and some other challenges. And so one of the things that was on the table, right, was that we had to make sure we'd actually graphed it when we changed liners and shells to make sure we had the right pulsation settings for the liner they were using. Yep. So what's the summary then of the front end of the curve? I bold it because it's the most important, is milking routine. And it's about stimulation and lag time from stimulation to unit attachment. We also got to think about vacuum and pulsation. Okay? And then just for a couple minutes, I'm going to switch to the back end because sometimes we forget the back end of the curve. But remember, that can have a strong influence on milking speed, right? So what do we think about in the back end? We think about unit alignment, automatic takeoff settings, and the use of manual mode. Notice on this cow right here, right? She had a very nice front end curve. And then she comes down, and then she dribbles out for another 2 minutes of time of unit on time with very little milk flow. During that time, we see teat damage, we see abnormal cow behavior, and it's a waste of parlor time. Okay, so one of the things that influence that is unit alignment. Here's an actual picture for those two double 24s I showed you. And you can see how poor the unit alignment is on this. So those quarters, we don't have even weight on all the quarters. So what do we see? We see quarters milk out at different rates. And you can see this, what we call a step down on the lactoquarter graph here at the end of milking. So you see individual quarters finishing here, and then it prolongs the unit on time on this cow. So she gives 36 pounds. She does it in just over 4 minutes, but a decent amount of that time, right, was spent because an individual quarter didn't have even weight on it, and it was slower milking than the other 2 or 3. And so remember, unit alignment can start to influence that. What else does unit alignment do? Can increase our risk for liner slips. As we just talked about, it influences the milking speed of individual quarters because we don't have even weight. And remember, it influences where that liner positions on the teat. Risk of teat damage, right? Certainly can add confusion when we think about making takeoff setting changes, because then we have quarters that aren't milked out or milked out, and people don't want to make changes if we have poor unit alignment, because it looks like we're leaving a lot of milk in the quarter. The reality is it's due to poor unit alignment on a lot of dairies and not necessarily the takeoff. Yep. So what about takeoffs or automatic takeoffs or automatic cluster removals if you're from the other side of the pond? Why would we think about doing it? Better for the cow, better for the milking speed of the parlor, right? And reduces unit on time. But the question is, what about milk? So that's certainly the question we get from dairymen, right? And there's some good studies out there. We did one as well because there wasn't a good study that was an actual controlled study to look at takeoff settings as high as we've seen them in New York, and I'm certainly as high as Dr. Reed has them out here in other areas. So what did we do? We took 689 cows, we randomized them. This was an AFI system. So we set the takeoffs for each individual cow. So for this group right up here, they were set at 2.8 pounds per minute. This bottom group of 345 cows at 1.8. Nobody in the dairy knows it. The cows are all commingled in their normal groups. They're eating, they're doing everything commingled. They walk in the parlor, the ID knows it, and it applies that takeoff setting. So that's the only difference, right? We run it for 6 weeks. What do we see? No difference in milk. Didn't lose any milk. No change in milk on that. What did we see, right? 27 seconds of unit on time. So about half a minute, right, of less unit on time when we had takeoffs. No difference in components. The short-term teat scores were better. In other words, the cows were happier. And we didn't see any differences in mastitis. Remember, we only ran it for 6 weeks, so it wasn't a long-term study. We really were looking for milk. Did we see milk differences? And we didn't. Which the other studies, none of them had seen it either, right? Some of the older work. So there. Now, if we're going to make takeoff settings, right, remember we need to take into account the complete picture. I wouldn't just go home and randomly start changing your takeoff, right? We got to think about what's going on with your dairy, what's the milking routine, the teat scoring, the goals of the dairy, right? What the milking equipment is, the strip yields. Try to do it in a systematic way. But I would encourage you to do it if you haven't done it. So how do we monitor that back end? If you got parlor data, I'd recommend using unit on time and time in low flow. And time in low flow means time less than 2 pounds a minute. If you don't have parlor data, then we got to time the unit on time, and we can watch the cows and see what they're doing at the end of milking. Of course, we can still do strip yield. So, in summary, when we think about the front end of the curve, what do we think about? We want you to time your routine, right? We want you to monitor it with 2-minute milk. Make sure we know what your claw vacuum is, and make sure you know what your pulsators are set at. When we think about the back end, check unit alignment in your parlor. Some parlors have very good unit alignment devices, and milkers don't use them. Some parlors have very poor unit alignment devices, so the milkers have no chance of aligning units. We got to decide which way it goes on your dairy, right? And check what your takeoffs are at. Adjust them if the picture warrants it. And how do we monitor that? Again, unit on time, time in low flow, and actually watching the individual units. So, with that, we'll take questions if you have any. Yep. 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 So the question, just to repeat the question for they're recording it, so I'm going to repeat the question just so. Yep. Her question was, why does it differ? Why does the lag time, I'm going to summarize your question, why does the lag time differ when we go from 2x to 3x to 4x? And it's a good question, right? What we think's on the table is there's differences in the amount of cisternal milk versus alveolar milk in those different populations of animals. That's what we think, right? Some of this is a little bit of what I call field research, which means when we change it in the field, we see differences. So we think that's why we got to wait a little bit longer. Because on the 2x, right, the udder pressure is going to be that much higher. And so theoretically, we might have more cisternal milk, less alveolar, so the timing is different. 4x, the amount of milk we harvest per milking is lower, even though maybe per day it's more, but per milking it's lower, and therefore we got to wait a little bit longer. That's what we're thinking. Yep. Mm-hmm. Question? So his question is, if we compare different brands of milking equipment, which one gives us the best data on flow and that sort of thing? Yeah. So I don't have an easy answer for you on that because remember, for most milking equipment manufacturers, right, there's a variety of products that they sell. So for most milking equipment manufacturers, they sell the top of the line products that are there. In other words, you can get all of the flow data and all the things that we ever want, right? And in robots now, we can get it all on the quarter level, more than we ever thought we wanted, right, at the quarter level. So it's probably there. Each of the milking equipment manufacturers have good data that's there and available, but we don't see that on every dairy, right? So the dairy can choose, right? They might buy a middle level takeoff or something that really doesn't have, it just has a flow sensor, right, and doesn't have a meter, and so we don't get that data from that dairy. So there's quite a bit of variation out there on farms of what we have, right? From the milking equipment manufacturer, I'd say to you, I don't see a lot of differences from their technology in terms of in their program. Now, ease of getting it out of software, maybe we can talk a little bit about that. You know, some maybe are a little bit easier than others or not, but most of them have the data that we need in there. In other words, they have the flow intervals, the 2-minute milk, they have the unit on time, they have all of those with meters in full system. Yeah. Fair for others in the room? Fair statement? Yeah. Question? So the question is, for cows with robots, do we get enough lag time? Yeah, and I'm going to answer that in two ways. One is, in my mind, robot cows are still cows, which means the lag time is still the same, right? So that means we still need that. We don't have all of a sudden they walk into a robot tomorrow and their lag time changes, right? That doesn't happen. Do the robots allow for it? We see differences definitely with that, and we work on that, right? We just wrote a robot report that we were at, a nice little two robot herd that's having challenges with how the cows are reacting to the robot. And so there's things you can do, right, and time it. Now that one, for that robot, was red, right on, right? In other words, the lag time for those cows from the first teat prep till the first teat attach was 100 seconds. Bang, right? But they're doing a couple extra brushes, they're doing a couple extra things. So I would definitely time it in robots. It definitely matters. And if we shorten it, we get into trouble. Okay? Other questions? Okay. So his question was about if we pre-dip first and force strip second, or we force strip first and pre-dip second. What do we see as differences? So what I'd say to you is that gets into the mechanics of how we design a routine on the dairy, right? So in my mind, the worst we would see, right, is if we pre-dip first and in that same pass we force strip, especially with foam, right, we strip most of the pre-dip right off. So if we're going to do that, we got to refoam, which means we got to use more dip, which is fine. We got dairies that do that, right? Now, if you're going to go down through and pre-dip the cows, come back, force strip the cows, come back, wipe the cows, that's fine, right? That we wouldn't see much. The challenge with that, right, is it's the second step you're doing is force stripping, which starts the stimulation. So you got to make sure your lag time is long enough, right? If we force strip first, right, it starts the clock running at the time we start force strip. Does that make sense, right? And then we pre-dip. So others can correct me in the room if I'm wrong. In terms of actual studies, that any studies have shown there's one versus the other that's any better or worse, no. It's about designing them in the routine and making sure that we get dip on the teat and it stays on there for 30 seconds. Yeah. And then how it works in the routine. Yeah. So it's a little bit of an individual farm management discussion. Yeah. Make sense? Yeah. Yeah, good. So the question was, do we see a difference in human hand versus robot brush? My answer to that is, until I showed the data there, one of that 72 stall rotor where we see that bimodal is a robot brush. In our hands, the one thing that's been good about like the handheld robot brushes is stimulation. In other words, they seem to do a real good job of stimulating. Teat end cleanliness, maybe not quite as good, but stimulation has been a decent thing. This was a robotic brush rotary, on the rotary, right? And for whatever reason on that dairy, the cows definitely told us that was not the same stimulation as when we were force stripping. And we saw it very quickly and very easily, and it never changed over the course of 6 months. So the cows didn't adjust to that robot brush. But there may be some other factors there that aren't to do with the actual robot brush. Do we see it on actual robots? I think we're fine with brushes. So in the end, that long-winded answer, probably on most of them, we don't see a major difference in stimulation. There's some other differences, but in terms of the stimulation it provides, force stripping versus that, we haven't been able to see a major. That's just field experience, right? We haven't done a side-by-side study. Yeah. Yeah. What we do different in a herd that had dirty udders? I'd walk out in the stalls and convince them to change their stalls. Yeah, okay, yeah. So, you know, we gotta add in another wiping step. You know, so we got to get the teats clean. And that's one of the challenges with robots a little bit, right, is the robot can't predict that tonight, right, if all of a sudden today we get dirty udders and then tonight. So, I mean, the goal, though, of course, would be to keep them coming in clean. You know, that's the best thing, is that we solve the problem out in the stalls, whether it's bedding, cow placement, cow positioning, bedding frequency, or those, so that they come in clean. Yeah. But when they get in there, right, we also got to get in the minds of the milkers, right, that says, if this cow is coming in dirty, it takes you longer to wipe her, but you got to do it. Right? Because the last thing we want to do is put units on dirty teats. Good with it? What are your thoughts on that? No, I was thinking about him. Any other thoughts you had? Okay, oh yeah, okay, sorry, yeah, that's fine, yeah. We can chat afterward then on that. Yeah. Okay, other questions? If not, thank you very much. Been a great audience, appreciate it. Yep.